We've looked at using get to fetch all posts from the database, but there's a lot more that we can do with Eloquent, and there are lots of methods that we can use in here to fetch information or create information in certain ways. We're going to cover the basics now, so you've got them covered, and then as things start to get a little bit more complicated, you'll have a really good base to work with. So the first thing that we're going to look at is another method called first. What this will do is it will return to us not a collection, because we're accessing the first post from our database. Let's give that a refresh and you can see we end up with a post model. Now that's not too much different because remember when we used get, we get a collection of posts. So it's pretty much working in the same way. We're just grabbing the first post from the database. You won't find yourself using this on its own too much because we usually have things like find to look up by a particular ID. Let's take a look at that now. We've got an ID of 1 and 2. Say we wanted to grab post 1 from our database. We use find 1, and again that's not going to return to us a collection because it's just one thing. It's going to return to us post 1. Let's open this up and verify that that's worked, and sure enough it has. Great. So as an example, if you did have example/ID, what you could do is you could look this up by passing the ID directly into here. You could return that particular post to a view, and then you could output information about that particular post. So if we just go over to example/1, that gives us post 1, and if we go to example/2, that gives us post 2. So hopefully you can start to see how this can come together in a real world app. Okay, so let's take a look at where clauses. Now, as well as using something like find, what we could also do is use a where clause here instead. So we could say where the ID, then we could use the equality check to say where it equals the ID that we're getting through. Now, this isn't quite going to look right. If we just give this a refresh, we end up with a builder. What we're actually seeing when we're chaining these methods on potentially is a builder that we can continue to build queries up from. So I could say where ID equals ID, and when I'm finished chaining on methods to build up a query to select information from the database, I could either use get or I could use first. Now in the case of looking something up by an ID with a where clause, you'd likely just want to get back that post. So if we give that a refresh, you can see we get exactly the same thing here. We get post 2. The only difference is we're using a bit more of a verbose where clause rather than just using find. But where is useful for other things. So I might want to look a post up where the title is post 1. So I'd switch this over to title post 1. And if we give that a refresh, of course we get post 1 output on the page. And we don't need to use an equality check. We can use greater than or equal to, less than, and so on and so forth. So for example, if I wanted to grab all posts where the ID was greater than 1, you'd expect that we would get back, if we use get, because we're potentially going to have a collection of items in this case, because we're pretty much asking for more than one item, we end up with this post 2, because that is greater than 1. If we just duplicate this down again and call this post 3, just so we've got a little bit more information to work with, and we switch this over to post 3, then we end up with 2 posts because they both have an ID greater than 1. You kind of get the idea. If you're used to writing SQL yourself, then this is almost like magic. Now, I mentioned earlier we can chain things. So for example, I could say, well, grab all posts that are greater than an ID of 1, and I could say where the title is something else. So you can just chain these on as much as you need to. It really depends on the kind of data that you're working with. So most of the time you'll just use methods like find to find a particular record by its ID. You'll perhaps use a where clause if the data is slightly different, and you'll use get if you want to return all posts to maybe list them on the page. And we'll be looking at this a little bit later when we pull everything together and see how this ties into pagination. Now, we've been looking at read operations, but what about writing? Well, let's look at creating a post. So let's get rid of the ID off the end of this example, so that doesn't make sense. And let's go ahead and use the create method to create a post out. So let's come over to example. Now this is going to fail at the moment because we're not filling the title in. So the SQL error we're getting back is field title does not have a default value. That basically just means that we're not filling it in and our database isn't filling it in either, so we can't do anything. Let's fill this in with a title. So let's say new post. And let's fill this in with a body, because they're the two pieces of information that when we submit through, we're going to probably need. So I'm going to say post body. Now this isn't actually going to work. If we give this a refresh, we get add title to fillable property to allow mass assignment. Now a mass assignment protection is there for security in terms of filling the fields that you need to fill. If we were allowed to do this and fill any fields in our database tables, and we were passing through slightly wrong data, for example, if we were allowing someone to pass through some kind of verified flag by accident, that would be filled in for us. So we have this for our protection. Let's go over to post and see what we can do. We know that kind of day to day when we're building out an application where we want to post things, we want the title and the body to be filled. They're the things that we can generally deem to be safe. So what we do is we add in a fillable property to our model and we choose what's fillable. So we're going to say title and we're going to say body. And you may have noticed this over on the user model. The name, email, and the password are all fillable fields for a user. So let's go back and see the difference. If I go ahead and do that, notice that we actually get this dumped out. We'll take a look at why that is in a minute, but you can see that post has been created inside of the database. Now, what we're actually doing interestingly here is we're assigning the result of a created post to post, and we're dumping it out. So what we actually get in the browser now is that new post. So if you are creating things and you immediately need to access that information, a model filled with the database result of what you've just created will be returned back to you. So you could maybe at this point redirect the user over with that information, and you could extract the post ID out from that in some way. But we'll be taking a look at that at the end of the course. Okay, so what else can we do? Well, we can update posts as well. Let's take the post that we've just created and let's update it. Now to do this, we need to work in a slightly different way. What we need to do is take either the ID or just any result from this. So let's say that we wanted to post find by a particular ID. So let's find that by 4. Now we know that this returns us a post model. It doesn't return us a collection. So we have a model now being returned to here, which we can then call the update method on. So we find something before we update it or delete it, as we'll be looking at in a minute. So to update it, we pretty much do the same thing as when we're creating. We just pass through just the columns that we need to update. So if I wanted to update the body and say updated body, that's going to work. So we're finding that post and we're updating it. Let's go ahead and get rid of the die dump here and just give that a refresh. Come over to the database, and sure enough, that has been updated. Now, if you look carefully, you'll see that the time for updated at has also been changed. So this will keep track of when something was last updated as well. So if you needed to output the last update for this, you've already got that in there ready to go. It's also just useful for kind of admin purposes as well to see when things have been changed. Now, lastly, what we can do is delete things. So if we wanted to find post 4 and then delete it, we could do that. Let's do something slightly different here though, just to kind of drill in that regardless of how we build up our query to fetch something, we can perform delete and update operations on it. So I'm actually going to change this to say where ID equals 4. Now we could call delete on this, and if we give that a refresh, we end up with 1, which means it's been deleted. But typically what we would do is we would say first, which returns to us a post, and then goes ahead and deletes. If, for example, you wanted to go ahead and delete everything where the ID was greater than 1, you could get away with just doing this and then say posts delete. So I'm deleting all posts where the ID is greater than 1. If we just go ahead and give that a refresh and come over, you can see that we end up with this. And that will actually tell you how many records have been deleted as the return value back from delete. But that's how we delete things. They'll be physically removed from your database. Laravel does provide options for things like soft deletes, which will mark it as deleted, but we're not quite going to look at that just yet.